Hello and welcome to Westwind, an audio podcast about cancer, technology in medicine, and policy issues. I'm host and medical oncologist Dr. Jack West from the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. You can find Westwind material at BeaconMedIC, one word.com, at iTunes, or just about anywhere you get podcast content. I would just ask that you show your interest and support by subscribing, commenting, sharing by telling friends and colleagues in person and on social media, and rating it however you feel is appropriate. You can also share your ideas and opinions by emailing us at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Sanjay Popat, who is a professor of thoracic oncology at the Institute of Cancer Research in London, England. Let's turn to policy questions. One valuable aspect of Twitter is that it fosters a sense of global community and people all over the world on Twitter sometimes chiming in on decisions and restrictions in different healthcare systems. I know you've provided some expert input for certain agents for NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence program, for many lung cancer therapies, and they make value-based decisions that often include denying coverage of treatments that may be considered an optimal choice in less restrictive healthcare systems when the cost of these drugs is very high. I'm interested in your thoughts on working within a more regulated but also a more egalitarian system than we have in the U.S. Are you and patients accepting of these restrictions that kind of value engineer treatments, but at least ensure that everyone gets access to some reasonable alternative, even if not the most expensive one? Or do you and patients bristle with a ceiling that's provided based on cost?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. It's a difficult question to answer because it sort of depends on the example that you're using. I mean, the UK healthcare system is, completely unique at being free at the point of access. And so we have this remarkable, scenario where we are routinely prescribing therapies, worth many thousands of pounds in clinic, without any concern as to whether the patient can afford or pay for them. And everybody's treated in a very standardized manner. And that is, the beauty of the judgment decisions that NICE make in their discussions with industry, the pharmaceutical industry, as to the level of discount that industry will give to the UK, or certainly in terms of NICE England, in order that that therapy can be made available. But it is problematic because, there's often quite a significant lag time. Jack, you present data at ASCO, for example, in the summer. Now, that treatment would probably become FDA approved by the end of the year, I guess, Jack. And you guys would then be able to use that, is my understanding. And you may be able to use it straight away after the data's presented. We in Europe are lagging because of the economic factors. Industry focuses on the FDA label first and then think about the European label. So often what you see is that the European label occurs, if not a year or more, later after the FDA label. And NICE will only review an indication if it has a European label. And historically, the timeframe between presentation of seminal phase 3 data and NICE approval has been unacceptably delayed. And that has caused a lot of consternation. It's caused a lot of angst with patient advocacy groups. The problem we've had with lung cancer is, until recently, we haven't had any patient advocacy groups because the prognosis of lung cancer has been so dismal. Only now, once we've now got stratified medicine, we now have different groups being set up that can bang the drum for our patients, and we as physicians can work alongside them. In parallel, the health sector has recognized that these delays are too long. And what they've tried to do is to work so that the whole NICE appraisal process occurs pre-EMA licensing. And so the theory is that at the same time as we have a European label approval from EMA, we in parallel have a approved NICE decision. Now, that doesn't often work because there's still often delay because of arguments about what is cost effective and what isn't cost effective. And that is problematic because on the face of it, patients don't have access. But the reality of it is actually slightly different because industry often work with the the UK Health Service, and as specialists, one of the jobs we have is to lobby with industry strongly to do whatever we can to make sure that those drugs can be made available. And so sometimes there are government-approved pre-licensing schemes where the drugs are made available. Sometimes there are industry-led schemes to make the drug available. And so by and large, most drugs are generally available shortly after important data are presented, at least until the time of licensing. There's often a bit of hiatus between licensing and approval, like we've currently got with frontline osimertinib. And that can cause a lot of problem. By and large, if there are other appropriate medicines, then most folk just sort of, get on with it. But it is all about ensuring that we have a system where we have value that's appropriate to the global health service, because the funds have to be used in a streamlined manner, not only for malignant diseases but also non-malignant diseases.
It sounds like in some ways you approve of the U.S. system in terms of the early approval and access it affords, but of course we also know that the U.S. healthcare system pays a remarkable amount, often far more for the same treatments than these would cost globally. And I would argue that the high prices in the U.S. market largely enable the feasibility of much lower prices elsewhere. Do you see an ideal path here? I mean, do you feel a certain envy and wish that the U.S. adopted a U.S. system with its attendant costs? Or do you feel that the U.S. is following an infeasible, unsustainable path by paying costs that are escalating at an astonishing pace, and the rest of the world doesn't follow that and still gets comparable results for less money?
Yeah, Jack, it's a really complex system. I mean, there are huge pros and cons with the US system, and certainly the costs of drugs in the US are just astronomical and unaffordable. And there's no way that the average US resident should be having to fork out for those costs. I mean, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. There has to be a halfway house. Your system is great because you have early access to very innovative medicines coming through. Perhaps some would argue that the US system is a bit too deregulated. Perhaps some medicines are available too early and maybe need more rigorous testing beforehand. But, I think that's a judgment on a case-by-case basis. Certainly the system that you have in the US is just not sustainable. And, I can't see how that can carry on with costs escalating. It really is a rush to the highest cost. What will the market bear, rather than what is the lowest cost that can be given, which is, generally what we have in the UK. And as a consequence, the prices that you guys are paying in the UK are subsidizing what happens. But because industry is a global field, we have to, I think, work together to ensure that, in whichever region we have the first licensing, which is by and large the US for all sorts of reasons, that we just put limits on those costs. Because, what is the value of a medicine? I mean, that is a really difficult question to answer. Why is it that some of these more less effective medicines are still valued at the same amount? The value of innovation that we have needs to be recognized, and we can't have a system where innovation is not rewarded, because otherwise the whole drug development framework will crash. And we can't, as a global economy, have that for our patients. But we have to have some level of sensibility where we can moderate costs and still have national level negotiation about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And I guess the UK does that fairly well, because it says, this is the maximum threshold that we are willing to pay, we are prepared to pay, and we expect a certain amount of activity for that particular price. And then it's entirely up to industry as to whether they'll come down to that level or not and negotiate about those thresholds. And I remember I wrote an article for ISLAC News, and the title was Drug Decisions. It takes two to tango. And it does take two to tango, both the healthcare system and industry, and the two really do need to talk together much more than they do at the moment. And I think those conversations need to be had at international levels between different countries as well.
The Canadian healthcare system is certainly closer to the U.S., and it's regulated but has broadly available treatments compared to the U.S. And Canada also has the benefit of having the U.S. system available relatively close by to decompress when people want to get a PET scan faster or want to get a medication that may not be available in Canada but is in the U.S. Given that 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border, it's a unique opportunity. Is there anything like that in the UK where people get supplemental insurance or readily travel to other places to get access if they're not happy with what's available with the NICE system restrictions? Or do people, as you say, get on with it and accept that that's good enough?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of mixed model. I mean, there is a private sector within the UK, but it's very small. You know, it accounts for about 10% of all healthcare in the UK, and certainly in thoracic oncology, because of the association of demographics, isn't the same for lung cancer as it is with getting private health insurance, then you tend to find that patients with thoracic malignancies don't have coverage. But, you know, there is the ability for them to, you know, pay out of pocket if they thought a PET scan was appropriate, etc. But the costs of drug therapy are just too prohibitive privately for the average person to be able to take on in a self-funding manner. And so I think the job of the oncologist is really to work as best as they can to streamline the access of medications for them. You know, are the medications going to be available to them as standard through NICE or the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is another government body? Or is there a named patient scheme or expanded access scheme available from them, either from that particular pharma partner or another pharma partner who has a similar drug which does the same thing? Or is there a trial which is looking at that question in the same sort of angle? I think more and more, as drug regulations become more and more complex, the job of the oncologist is very much to try and guide patients through that complex minefield of what they need and where it's available, and, you know, where it's not available, you know, what the costs are and whether they are doable or not. Mostly it's prohibitive because of the excess costs.
What's the current status in the UK of molecular testing, particularly broad molecular testing such as next-gen sequencing? We're currently in a transition from focusing on previously just 2 or 3 targets, but now 4 or 5 or more. And in that world, doing broader next-gen sequencing is appealing, but also has challenges of cost and turnaround time. Is this an approach that's now widely adopted and available in the UK, or is this something that is a significant hurdle to enact broadly within the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think we're at a tipping point in the UK for broader molecular coverage. So by and large, in the UK, we are generally testing for EGFR as a single gene, PD-L1, ALK and ROS, mainly by IHC rather than molecular. And the coverage that we have for broader panels is very much limited to NICE-approved indications. Now, that's very much been the historical landscape. So, for example, KRAS testing per se isn't funded, or BRAF testing per se isn't funded because, you know, in the UK, dabrafenib trametinib is not a reimbursed combination. So what's happened is that institutions have either set up their own research NGS programs, or they've set up collaborations with the main UK research funder, Cancer Research UK, who has a broad NGS research program embedded within the UK. But actually, things are going to change quite quickly. And as of the new year, next year, the NHS has recognised it hasn't really got a handle on what's going on in genetics, both germline genetics and in somatic genetics, and has mandated a national test directory of which genes should be tested for and which cancers, and an overall ceiling cost for how much that should be. And essentially what that means is that within the first, well, probably the second quarter of next year, we're going to slowly start moving on to centralized NGS testing for all cancer patients. There are 7 large hubs which have been identified in England. And these are going to be the hubs that are going to be responsible for delivery of that NGS. And I think, moving forward towards the latter part of 2020, that should all be, firmly established, firmly embedded, where we have broad-based NGS for all of our patients going through. And then it's going to be a real key issue to make sure that the samples that our diagnosticians are taking are really good enough quality to make sure that those genotypes can pass with broad coverage first time round.
Apologies for turning to politics, which is always a contentious issue, but in the U.S. things are very volatile, and maybe one comfort that we have is that the U.K. at least rivals that chaos we are experiencing and maybe even exceeds it. I'm interested in how uncertainty around Brexit plans or just possibilities affect medical care in general and cancer care in particular in terms of budgets and access to drugs and interventions.
Yeah, Jack, this is a really thorny issue and, never a dull moment in politics, as they say. It's absolute chaos at the moment. And, in some respects, it's been really problematic. And in some respects, it's been business as normal. So, for example, if I look at what our colleagues in the world of CT screening are doing, they've really not been affected by the politics of Brexit or potential Brexit at all. We have a large number of CT pilots set up in the UK, which are ready to go, started screening patients and delivering on the promise of CT screening of high-risk individuals. We're still awaiting a national green light, but very much regardless of what's been going on with the chaos of Brexit, the local regional areas where these programs are set up have identified this as a major priority to reduce the long-term burden of cancer and have moved their funds towards it. So in some areas, our functioning has been completely independent of what's going on with the craziness of Brexit or no Brexit in the background. But in other areas, we've been suffering. And the biggest problem that we've had is a huge lack of investment in the health service since the financial crisis, really. I mean, the health service hasn't been hit as hard as many other aspects of social care, but it's certainly not kept pace in terms of the level of investment that is required, given the increasing complexity of delivery of care and the aging population. If you combine that with uncertainties of the future, there are increasing numbers of vacant posts, both in terms of physicians and in terms of nurses, and the environment that physicians have to work in, their regulatory environment has become more and more complex, less and less gratitude is perceived by many physicians. We've had junior doctors going on strike for the first time in years. There's an ongoing row with the government about pensions for senior doctors. And it's all conspiring to ensure that the health care service is really stretched at the moment. And what that means for patients is a lot of uncertainty. And we as physicians see that uncertainty a lot. We don't know what's going to happen. Is there going to be Brexit? Is there not going to be Brexit? What is the time frame of resolution? What does that mean for funding? At the moment, we've got a general election next week. I guess by the time this goes out, it'll all be over and we'll know how things are, what's going to happen in the UK. The parties are all promising great investment in the UK. And, whoever's in charge, one thing is very clear, the NHS needs a huge amount of investment to come back up to any level of functioning it had been like before the financial crisis. When it comes to CT screening, we've got a huge radiology shortage. How are we going to implement CT screening, even if the National Committee did say that this is cost effective? Who's going to read the scans? How are we going to operate on all these patients with small T1 tumours when the system's already under immense strain with the workload that the system is coping with? So, Brexit has just been a big diversion. We've not really been focusing on the investment and the optimization of the health sector that we've needed to do in the past few years. And the sooner that the whole issue is sorted and settled, the sooner we have additional investment into the economy, the better we'll be.
One other transition in the U.S. has been a shift away from federally funded, federally supported research and cooperative groups, which are still present and doing good work, but not operating at the same scale that they were a few decades ago. More and more work is now being funded by pharma companies, which has led to great innovation, but also leads to shifts in what gets studied and what doesn't. I'm interested in your perspective on how much of that is happening in the UK or in Europe more broadly in terms of the kinds of questions that are asked and who is supporting research. Because my sense is it's global, that there's a huge amount of research in cancer that's now being funded more and more by pharmaceutical sponsors.
Yeah, Jack, I think you're right. I mean, I think all the big questions about drug development are very much industry focused, and these are global questions. But, there are huge areas of research, certainly in terms of clinical research, that need to be done, which, are just not taking the same level of priority as they would have been years ago. And the funding for clinical research is harder than it ever has been. Now, this isn't entirely the fault of pharma. I mean, we've got multiple factors going into this. The cost of healthcare is rising, the cost of scans, the cost of blood draw, the cost of doing research is, higher now than it ever was before. The complexity of doing research now is bigger now than it ever has been before. And the governance and infrastructure to run a trial is just absolutely huge. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, you could come up with a great idea, run a study, you and your friends. It wouldn't take you that long. You'd put a basic protocol together. You'd enroll a few patients. You'd get some really interesting results, and you'd be able to, come up with some nice conclusions. But, these days, it's, at least a year between having an interesting idea and getting the first patient into a study. And that's because the regulatory issues, finding the funding to do these academic studies. The only thing that I think is saving all of this is it's brought us all together. And it's brought us all together as a global community because, Jack, your problems in the US are exactly the same as my problems here in London in terms of academic research, and exactly the same problems as my colleagues in France and in the Netherlands. And certainly when we're looking at research at scale, and even sometimes in rare indications not at scale, we really have had fostered excellent collaborative networks in Europe to be able to answer some of these questions. But you're right, it's not easy, and the funding that's required to do that is not straightforward, and we are having to liaise with industry for those, which by definition means that those questions that industry wants to have answered are answered first, and then secondary questions about what we do with certain drugs and scenarios are then left for academics to pick up and find its piece within the national landscape.
I certainly agree that there's a gratifying aspect to the collaboration, more and more, across national borders, and I've been impressed with the momentum of ESMO and the sense of collaboration of different countries in Europe. Sometimes that's 2 or 3 countries working together, and sometimes it's an even broader confederation. What's your sense of the momentum of ESMO and these collaborations? And does the Brexit initiative possibly pose a threat to that?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So the collaborations we have with colleagues in Europe are fantastic. And, the one thing that we've figured out is we're all part of one family. We're all part of one giant family of experts wanting to do the best for our patients. And we do that at the national level, and we certainly do that at the international level. The mission of ESMO is to deliver on research, to deliver on education, to deliver on the highest standards of functioning. And, whatever happens with Brexit, I don't think that that's going to really change our fundamental relationship with our colleagues in Europe, because our networking through ESMO, the deliverables that we have with ESMO and the European societies across the sector will still continue. Brexit is very much a political and financial issue, and so there will be financial decoupling, political decoupling between the UK and the rest of Europe. Now, that will probably result in risk to funding for academic programs, risk to funding for teaching. But, I really am hopeful that if we do go down that road of Brexit, that we have some understanding that this is important and we can try and preserve these relationships as best as possible. Because, it's a two-way street. The UK learns a lot from Europe, and Europe learns a lot from the UK. And only together can we stand together? So, I like to be positive and optimistic that even if Brexit does go ahead, we'll still be able to rise above this as individuals, all striving for the same common purpose of improving the outcomes of our patients and still fulfill the international missions that we have as our collaborative groups.
Sanjay, thank you so much for taking the time. I really admire the work you've been doing in your clinical trials that are affecting and moving forward the entire field of lung cancer, but also your ability to synthesize everything for commentaries on an international level in what you speak on. It's all great work, and I also really enjoyed learning about your personal story, and I hope to catch up with you at a future conference. So take care.
Great, Jack. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. The West Wind Podcast is a Beacon Medical Interchange production with sound engineering and distribution by Mark Lindsay of Talking Speaker. We hope you'll be motivated to subscribe, whether at BeaconMedIC.com, through iTunes, or through another podcast service. Please also rate it, and I hope you'll be inclined to tell friends and colleagues in real life and on social media. We're always happy to get your suggestions and other input at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. Talk to you again soon.